Hi, welcome to Project Geospatial. I'm Adam Simmons, and here with me for this session is Jennifer Harrison, president of Teach Me GIS. And the topic of this episode is, education in geospatial. So educating geospatial technology in a constantly changing industry. And Jennifer's on to help us understand that. Jennifer, how about we start by help us understand who you are specifically and what your roots are in GIS.
Sure. So I grew up in Western Kentucky, and I did my bachelor's degree at Murray State University. I studied mathematics, but about in my senior year, I fell into GIS accidentally by seeing a neighbor messing with some satellite imagery. So I got my master's in GIS back then. And so I've been doing GIS since about '89, GIS and remote sensing. I moved to Belize in Central America after graduating for a couple of years and worked for the Ministry of Natural Resources there, helping them set up their first GIS. And since then, I've been in Houston, working in the oil industry and working for state government and doing consulting and GIS training. So I started Teach Me GIS back in 2001, and I've been teaching GIS to a lot of different industries ever since.
That's a long time. So you've been doing this for Teach Me GIS for nearly 20 years. And so talk to me about what kinds of things do you teach? Do you just teach the basics? Do you teach advanced courses? What's the aperture of everything that you do for education?
Sure. So as an Esri business partner, we primarily teach Esri courses, but we teach all levels from very basic, here's what a polygon is, up to programming with Python, the Python API, spatial analysis, spatial analyst, 3D analyst. So kind of the full suite. We don't teach a lot of how to implement ArcGIS server or implement a platform, right? We teach more the end users and the GIS professionals. That's what we do.
No, that says a lot right there. So, before we dive into that a little bit more, I want to understand some of those roots that you were just expressing about yourself. So you went to Belize and you started a GIS department, something like that, or their entire. What was that about?
Yes, the Ministry of Natural Resources had gotten funding from the British Overseas Development Agency and USAID to start a GIS program to manage their land records and also manage all of their protected areas, the bird sanctuaries, the Mayan ruins, the national parks. And I worked with several other people there, a gentleman from England and a couple of several Belizeans on building this GIS at the Land Information Center. It's still there as a portion of the Ministry of Natural Resources. It was a really interesting project back then on all command line ArcInfo on Sun Unix machines.
Yeah, no, and the reason I ask is I want to open people's perspectives and what kind of other opportunities are there with GIS and help people understand what all can be done with it, right? So, and I think you just highlighted something that people don't hear that aspect of it very often. That you can literally help a country or a city or even a county build from the ground up, map their needs out, start from scratch, and those opportunities are still out there and growing every day.
Yeah, absolutely. The foundation of that project was to protect protected areas, right? But the project had to have a source of funding that would last. So in addition to building a GIS to protect all of the natural resources, we also implemented this land information system as a part of it to upgrade the tax records. So the increase in tax income, because the tax payments were being better managed, helped to offset the cost of maintaining the GIS over the years. And just recently, I don't know, 5 years or so ago, someone flew Belize with LiDAR and detected a lot of ruins that we didn't even know were there. It was really fascinating to see that.
Does that make you want to kind of go back and participate to some level?
Yeah, yeah, it really does.
So the transition to Teach Me GIS, what inspired you to get that off the ground? And that's a big change going from what you were doing before to just education, right?
Yeah, it is. I moved from Belize to Houston when my husband came to school here, and I started working for a consulting firm. And around the year 2000, the consulting firm got bought out, and I had been doing both consulting and training at this company. And when they got bought out, they closed the training center, and I was actually quite fortunate. One of the biggest oil companies in Houston went to that company and said, look, we know you're closing training, but can Jenny keep doing the training for us? And so with both their blessings, the biggest client and the consulting firm, I started Teach Me GIS to continue to provide this service. And we teach maybe thousands of people every year how to get productive with GIS. And as I mentioned, we primarily do Esri products, but we do a lot of things that surround those products as well. Like we teach FME, which is a really cool tool for flipping data around, right? So we're trying to, the things that we struggled to learn, that's what we try to teach, right? Anything that we couldn't find a class for, but we found it to be a really useful tool, we learn it and we put the classes together for it.
Yeah, that's great, especially that endorsement by those companies that want you to continue that work afterwards. That's incredible. So for the organization itself, how many people you got on the staff? How many teachers do you have available to you, instructors? How does that all work?
Yeah, we're quite small. There are 10 of us altogether. 3 of those are support staff. And the rest of us are trainers and curriculum developers. And we also do consulting in between classes to keep our skills up. Because it's really tough to just teach intro to ArcMap forever. And then you don't get to expand your own skills, right? So we constantly take projects on as well.
So that brings me to an interesting segue here of how much has things changed from when you started 20 years ago to what's going on now? Well, what kinds of changes in technology? What kind of changes in the courses that you teach? Where have you seen the biggest shifts from when you where you first started this work?
The industry, of course, has changed tremendously, right? When I started doing and then teaching GIS, I had to teach 4 days of Unix operating system before I could start teaching people Arc, because this was all command line back then. And we didn't have PowerPoint, so it would be me, a whiteboard with a marker for 5 days teaching intro to Arc after they had 4 days of intro to Unix first. So they had to learn the operating system first. And so back then, people who came to class knew they were wrestling with a beast, right? And they were ready for it. They knew if they wanted to make a map, they were going to have to type out all the commands. Nowadays, so you only got the people who were really serious about it and really wanted to do this GIS stuff. They were PhD geologists, they were engineers and scientists. We used to laugh that you kind of had to dedicate your life to GIS if you want to get good at it. I remember running into a guy at a little cafe in Belize out on one of the islands, and I only ran into him because he was sitting behind me, and I heard him say, "See, I brought my ArcInfo book with me," and he pulled a book out of his backpack on vacation. He was studying. That's the kind of dedication you got back then to GIS. And nowadays, of course, it's much more of an end user tool for people who just want to use it for that, right? So, I mean, you get casual users of GIS who only touch it once in a while now. And we didn't have that early on. The software vendors have helped a lot with that in trying to make apps that give you access to geospatial data a lot faster, right? Put it at the fingertips of everyone, which is great. But you still need those people in the background, those geospatial professionals who do understand the science and have dedicated their life to it to make sure all the data is accurate and that these end users, these people who are just casual users of GIS, get the right answers and correct data, right, for their analysis. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So not just the technology itself, but actually I found it really interesting that you feel that you had to do like 4 or 5 days of Unix training first just to establish that background. So not just the GIS applications itself have developed significantly, but the baseline technology, the supporting technology that stuff is built off of is also streamlined to an extent where you don't. I'm sure you still don't teach 4 or 5 days of Unix training now, right?
No. I don't even have to teach people Windows usually. Normally they know how to, navigate the Windows directory structure.
Yeah. So where has the bulk of that time gone? Have you spread it to more complex problems and solutions based off of what the technology is doing these days? And aside from the applications itself, how do you feel like the data has changed and grown?
Yeah. So for the applications in the training, back then we did teach. I did teach like AML programming, right? And we're still teaching programming classes. But I think what has changed is the breadth of applications that we're teaching, because we're teaching online applications and field data collection apps and image analysis apps. So yeah, now we are. We're teaching a lot more applications, a wider breadth, and we're doing a lot of very specific things. Like there's an app called GomCube that is all the data and a toolbar for the Gulf of Mexico. So we teach specific apps like that now. Here's how you access everything you need to know about the Gulf of Mexico. Where back then we pretty much taught, here's how to use ArcInfo. So we're teaching a lot more apps. And we also do teach people how to find data for use in your GIS, because back then we were having to teach people how to create the data. We had to show everyone how to digitize. Nowadays, we show people how to get data from Living Atlas or from REST services or from government data hubs, and we show them how to integrate data, how to do table joins to get over to Oracle data or SQL Server data. And so it's more about data integration now, where it used to be a lot about creating the data. I mean, I haven't seen anyone georeference a USGS quad sheet and digitize the rivers off of it in about 25 years, right? So that's changed a lot, and the availability of data is just incredible. I mean, anybody who wants to can jump into a GIS software today and map their hometown. Well, okay, not anybody, but a large portion of the people in the world, not just here in the U.S., right? That wasn't the case when I started. In the early 90s, I taught a bunch of middle school teachers. When I was still in college, we had a summer program where we taught middle school teachers how to do GIS. We were using a product called Idrisi back then, and we gave them a satellite image of their school. And for many of them, that was the first time they had ever seen their school from above. And we gave them a shape, back then it was a coverage of their roads and a terrain map of their school. And they took it back and taught middle schoolers in the early 90s how to do GIS. It was really, really cool for them to see. And at a time when, this was in rural Kentucky, in a time when a large percentage of that population had never been in a plane, so they didn't know what the Earth looked like from above. And you couldn't just pull up Google and check, right?
So speaking of which, so technologies such as when Google Maps and Earth came out, because that happened during, while you were, not long after you established the company, right? So how did that produce some game changers for you? And how hard was it as being instructors to keep up with these changes and change the curriculum as you go? Do you feel like it was a really rapid process for you? And what do you do to keep yourselves up to date?
That's a real challenge, I think, with all teachers all over the world in every subject, is staying up to date on the content. Unlike a math teacher who still has to teach the same multiplication tables that they taught 30 years ago, it's very different in IT, of course. And And so we spend a lot of time as instructors on our own personal development and trying to keep up with what's going on in the industry so that we can see what's probably going to be popular in 6 months or be useful in 6 months. And I try to encourage that in all of my classes. Every time we teach someone, we tell them, we are teaching you the foundation. We are giving you the base upon which you can learn GIS, but you've got to learn GIS your whole life. You've got to be a lifelong learner. You've got to get your company to send you to conferences, or at least get to watch the videos from the conferences so you can see what's coming down the line, because you might be writing a script right now to solve a problem that someone else has already got a tool for, or maybe that tool is even already in your software, but you haven't found it yet because you haven't been able to keep up with what's going on in the industry. And so we stay on the blogs, we go to conferences, we constantly read everything that comes out from our vendor, Esri, and try to keep up with it and try to find those little tidbits that we think will be useful to our audience, to our clients, so that we can mention them in class. And we just consider ourselves like we're constantly spreading the news of GIS and what's new. Like, no, don't do it that way. There's a tool. It's going to be here in a few months. I remember I had a friend in Belize, actually, who had a contract to go GPS all the road signs in the country. And he was on an older version of Arc. And when you got to the newer version, there was a tool called Geotagged Photos to Points, where you just go take the picture and turn it into a point. And just by giving him that little tidbit, move up to this next version, his life was completely simplified for that project. But if you're not, you don't have your ear to the industry, right? Because you're busy doing your regular day job, you might miss those little tidbits. And that's a part of what we consider our job. We go speak at a lot of conferences and share whatever cool stuff we've found. And yeah, so I encourage that to everybody. You got to be, if you're going to do GIS and you're going to be the GIS person in your organization, you got to be that person to filter the data and spread the news about cool stuff.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I relate a lot of this to our tradecraft, or keeping up with it, similar to the medical industry. You know, how doctors have to keep up with journalists, journals out there, medical journals, and new techniques that are going on. We have to do the same thing, keep up with the tradecraft, because it is we're in a period, we're in an era where this stuff is changing faster than it's ever been before. And not just for keeping up with your own skills, but you're trying to come up with a new technology, a new application, that competitive and not just competitive analysis, but being informed of what's out there could save you a lot of time and money at the same time.
Yeah, that's true. It's hard to sometimes to get managers to understand how important it is to give you a little bit of time each week to learn something new, And for the casual users that I mentioned earlier who just touch GIS all the time, I don't expect them to be able to stay on top of everything related to this whole GIS environment. But that's the job of the GIS professional in the organization, to filter that information, that tons of information we get every day about the geospatial world, pull out the tidbits that are important to our organization and share them, right? But even way back in Belize when I worked for the Ministry of Natural Resources, so this was 1990. I created my colleagues and I created a GIS newsletter that we sent around to the entire Ministry of Natural Resources to let them know what we were doing and share the information of what was going on. Most of them had never heard of GIS because it was such a new thing back then. But the newsletter really got the conversation going. It got people coming to ask us for products that they didn't even know before that they could ask for.
So we had one comment from the audience here. You saw it pop on the screen a little bit earlier. Migrating from ArcMap to ArcGIS Pro must have been tough for the students as well as the instructors. Can you talk about that transition from those versions of products? Because that was a big change. I remember using ArcMap as well, and then switching to ArcGIS Pro, and the amount of capabilities in that was incredible. I feel like I was, when I was using a hammer for something specific, now I get it given a whole toolbox.
Yeah. I I was around for the command line ArcInfo to ArcMap conversion in around the year 2000. And that was a 5-year transition before my clients stopped asking for the old ArcGIS. It was called ArcInfo before the old ArcInfo training. So a 5 years transition, and we're still in the midst of that 5-year transition from ArcMap to Pro. And I do have clients who still come here to take ArcMap training. But you're right, the transition was difficult, and it was more difficult the longer you'd been using ArcMap. So if you were brand new to ArcMap, no problem. They were willing to give up ArcMap. But I still just recently had someone say, "Oh, I can't go to Pro because it can't do ABC." And I said, "Actually, it's been doing ABC for about 3 versions. You might want to relook at it." People got kind of scared early on, but anytime there's a new software, it's a challenge, right? It's a challenge to transition over to that whole new version and still get your daily work done. One of the big advantages of Pro is its really tight integration with web services and online. And once people see that capability, that you can quickly share to an online map, you can share to your field data crew, you can pull data from online. That's really, I think, what convinces a lot of people to go over to Pro and makes it worth their time. But it definitely was a challenge. We spent a good few years developing a migrating class to try to just hit the important bits and show people how powerful that tool was. And the 2D, 3D visualization side by side is awesome too, without having to have a 3D license. Just with basic Arcgis Pro, you can take a LiDAR data set in and force it to be the elevation source for any one of your data sets. You can drape any of your data sets over that LiDAR surface. So there's some little enhancements like that that are just awesome. But I do still have quite a few clients who are trying to figure out how to make that transition.
No, that makes a lot of sense too. I think it was a hard transition for me because when I come out of the government or working in government contracts, I had these set applications in place, and ArcMap was one of them. So when I was all of a sudden working completely commercial, all of a sudden, like, what happened to ArcMap? And all it was is ArcGIS Pro, and I'm like, okay, well, I've heard of this, and I've used it. But I use it for something specific, with the analyst toolbox or the plugin for it and a few other little plugins. But I always used ArcMap when I was in the government for very imagery specific things. And so I was used to just going to that application, opening it up, and diving right into my work. So now I really appreciate ArcGIS Pro, but now I have a more complex workflow I have to kind of work out and outline. And that was a rough transition. I appreciate the capabilities a lot more than I did a couple of years ago. But it was a rough transition for me as well.
I think for a lot of people, maybe military was the same, they had written custom toolbars for ArcMap and custom functionality. And it took quite a while to get that custom functionality ported over to Pro because the first few versions of Pro didn't have all the capabilities that were needed, right? And when you couldn't just take your Python scripts or whatever other tools you had and just use them straight away in Pro since the data model and the structure of the software has changed a lot. So a lot of organizations waited until at least Pro version 2 before they started trying to port their customizations over. So that's been part of the delay as well, I think.
So how do you feel about the importance of teaching the science of GIS?
I think it's crucial. I think it is important to know your audience. We have, as we mentioned before, we have the casual GIS users who have a full-time job. Like I might be a pipeline engineer, or I might be a transportation planner, and I just use GIS for my job, right? It's just another tool that I have. Those guys need to know some of the science, but they don't need to know everything in depth, right? I need to teach my transportation engineers in Louisiana, here's what Louisiana State Plains South is, and here's why you don't want to use that NAD 27 thing. Or if you get NAD 27, here's what's going to happen. Switch it over to NAD 83 or WGS 84. But I don't need to teach them everything about projections and datums and datum transformations. They need to know coordinates are important, here's how they work and watch out for them. But then I'm hoping that each one of those casual users does have a GIS professional that they can go to when they have big issues, like I'm about to pay a contractor to go out and collect data for me. It's going to be a 3-month contract. Let me talk to my GIS specialist first and get the details on what coordinate system I need. So then teaching what these casual users also need to understand something about spatial data in general, right? And what spatial analysis is, and the implications of doing a 200-foot buffer in one coordinate system versus another, and why they come out different. Why my buffer, my 200-foot buffer might be different from John's down the hall, even though we were working on the same data. Maybe we're using different coordinate systems. So they need that foundation, so that, number one, so they can get the right results from their analysis, but also so they know what the software is capable of, right? They need to understand that big picture and understand this is real science behind this map. You can trust it, and here's the limits of where you can trust it, right? I also think those casual users need to have the big picture of the platform, so they understand there are web tools, there are cell phone apps and mobile apps, there's desktop software, there's server software. Not all the guts, right? They don't need to know all the guts of an Oracle database even, but they need to understand that there's a database that lives down the hall. It's not on your machine, and somebody might be updating it nightly, and you might see different results tomorrow. So I think that the casual user needs some understanding of the science and as well as a big picture platform of the software, so that they can make decisions on what is the best app for their problem. But then I think the GIS person really needs the guts of that science. They need to understand how to fix a data set that was given to them with no coordinate system, how to figure out what coordinate system that shapefile might actually be in if it's missing an SHP, a PRJ file. So I think you have to teach people differently. You can't just send everybody to a GIS 101 class. You need to teach people who are casual users slightly differently than people who are the GIS professional. And then on top of that, of course, you got the developers and the sysadmins who often come over from a computer science degree. And I really appreciate the fact that many of the companies I work with here in Houston send their developers and their IT people who support GIS into our GIS training classes, so they understand the structure of a geodatabase and why a world file is important to go along with that TIFF. So,
Well, that also gives them a hint of what their customers or users might be using as well. And that's something that's very valuable. How the developers understand what their customers are using from a workflow standpoint helps them make better software.
Mm-hmm. And also helps them not reinvent the wheel. I actually sat in on a meeting years ago where a contractor had sold this client. The contractor was going to write a tool that would take a spreadsheet that had lat-longs in it and turn it into dots on the map. And the client was paying for that development when they owned the software that would do that. So helping the developers know what the software's capabilities are, they kind of know, well, ask first. There's several hundred tools in there. Ask first. Ask a GIS professional if that functionality already exists before you go write it.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of back up here on the data, on your website, and you've said it before here in the show, but and you had the sign right behind you that you're an Esri partner. Are you a partner with anybody else? What I mean is data providers. How do you get the data that you teach in your courses?
Primarily, we use government-provided data from state government and local government that they make available to the public, and we always get permission to use it. We do also have some clients who have shared data with us and told us that it's totally fine to use it in our courses. We are partners with a couple of data providers, like the group who does the Gulf of Mexico data set, and we have some partnerships with a couple of imagery vendors who have given us, like Nearmap has given us samples of their data to use as well. And we're partners with a few different software groups, like Safe Software, with their FME product. But the majority of our data, it used to be a real challenge. When I started teaching, we had to make a lot of our data, or we got a lot of data from U.S. Geologic Survey. Because
and we talked right before the show on this that, when you first started out in your career, you just had Spot and Landsat available, right?
yeah,
So, and
USGS topo maps.
and now I have a hard time keeping up with how many providers are out there, almost by a month by month basis. How many trying to stand up and launch. So from EO providers, SAR, even IR, and now RF collectors. It's
incredible, right? When I went to Belize, we were fortunate enough to have 7-band Landsat imagery that, if I remember correctly, was 30-meter resolution of the entire country of Belize, because I think one of the military, somebody was doing some studies down there, and anyway, we were able to get that data, but we had one picture of it. We couldn't get it monthly or even twice a year. We had one. We just had to deal with that date. And if there were clouds over an area, that's it. You just had to wait until maybe a few years later you'd get another one. And now to imagine that you could take a drone out and fly over your neighborhood and have the imagery today, it's just incredible. And then those devices that are also doing the kind of like 3D LiDAR, where you can set a device inside a building and it does a 3D map of a room. It's just incredible what's possible nowadays.
Oh, I know Google at one point was integrating that within the phones on default for one version for a little while. They had a beta phone of that. That was incredible. Just stick it in a room, like you said. It's almost hooked into your camera. Once you take a picture of a room, it does the LiDAR scan for you.
Yeah.
Incredible. No, the changes in technology, I imagine, really drastically changed your educational curriculum over time. And just to watch this transition, this progression of what you've been able to do with your students, I imagine has been just. It's hard in retrospect to track everything, right? So
it really makes this field interesting. As I tell every young person getting into this field, you never have a day to get bored, because you're constantly, every time you think you know something new comes out. And anyway, I've been using ArcGIS since 1989, and I don't claim to know even 50-60% of it, because there's just so much out there. So many buttons I still haven't pushed.
So from a demographic approach and what kind of students and clients that you do, so do you feel like do you reach down to the high school level or middle school level, or do you mainly touch maybe aspiring career professionals in college, or is it primarily industry?
Most of our clients are already employed in the industry. We do a lot of training for oil and gas companies. We do a lot of training for state and local government. We have a lot of clients who we have trained for 10 or 15 years, individual people who just keep coming back and learning more and more. So many of them start with us with a very basic GIS training, like maybe they just got transferred into a position as a GIS tech, and we help them grow all the way to the point where they can be developing their own tools, or at least doing all of their own analysis. But so for the most part, they are professionals working in the industry already. Many of them, as I mentioned, are engineers or geologists. We also do some volunteer work where we've gone out to high schools and taught GIS to high school students. And we get a lot of college students who are maybe have graduated in a field of natural resources or environmental science or biology, and are trying to get that capping skill that makes them stand out on their applications. And it's funny, it tends to be a lot of the children of the parents that I've taught in the past. They come over, and that has helped quite a few actually really shine on their resume and gotten jobs. So that's always good to see.
Great. No, I appreciate that. So I think we're going to wrap this up here. But with that said, I want to get your take on any last minute plugs, anything that you'd like to let the audience know, either about Teach Me GIS or something interesting that you feel is going on in the community. I would like to kind of put it out there to where do you see some of this going, and where do you see the most popular, where do you see interest in the industry going right now?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of interest in people getting into the application development side of GIS and people using apps. But I just want to, I think it's really important that people continue to learn the science, geospatial science, before they get in and start developing all these apps, because otherwise we can get all sorts of a mess of data. Down here in the petroleum user group, we have we often say about the saying about putting lipstick on a pig, right? And once you start making those apps and they're pointing to bad data, you're going to get some really bad results from it. So let's not lose focus of the power of GIS and geospatial in general, but it's all based on science, and the science has got to be right in order for these apps to spit out the right data. But yeah, I appreciate you having me on. It's been fun talking to you. We are Teach Me GIS is, as I said, as I mentioned before we got on, we've transitioned all of our training to online instructor-led courses. We put 2 instructors in every class to make sure everyone gets a lot of attention. I mean, all the classes are hands-on. So we set up virtual machines and we're watching what you're doing. And so it is a good time to learn GIS and brush up on your skills while you're not in the office. Then when things come back, when the world gets back to normal, we'll all jump right back in and be doing some really cool GIS stuff.
And we'll post the website in the show notes on wherever it's posted. So you can find Teach Me GIS at teachmegis.com. This is the president and founder of Teach Me GIS, Jennifer Harrison. So thank you for coming on with us to discuss you and the company and everything that you're doing to help education and promote the industry as a whole. So, and the profession. I'm Adam Simmons of Project Geospatial. Thanks everybody for listening.